if you follow the news closely, in the year of 2024, now we're fast approaching almost the third year for the war in Ukraine. Now, given the fact that today, if you look at the attitude among the international community members, it's pretty divided. Some countries believe it is time for us to pull out in terms of supporting the nation of Ukraine, mainly that even though we've seen some of the major military progress, but it's still a long shot before we can declare the victory for the nation of Ukraine. But on the other side of the table, again, for the country of the United States, strongly declare that it is time for us to continue to be unified, and especially when we are looking at this ongoing threat from the nation of Russia and under the current leader Vladimir Putin. Too often we tend to believe that this war is going to make a huge impact among the international community. In fact, indeed. But however, how should we understand the attitude from Putin? And some scholars believe that despite the war that Putin has already lost, and it is time for us to reshape the strategy, understand the result of the war. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who is the Mr. Rajan Menon. Mr. Menon is the director of the Grand Strategy Program at Defense Priorities, and he's the author, among other books, which is called Conflict in Ukraine, The Unwinding of the Post-Cold War Order. Well, Mr. Menon, and welcome to The Missing Piece.
Thank you for inviting me, Will.
Well, Mr. Menon, again, as we mentioned before, initially when I discovered you, because this amazing article that you wrote, which is called Putin Has Already Lost. Now, let's go to the reality that we're facing today. As we mentioned before, we are fast approaching almost the third year for the war in Ukraine. Now, this is what you wrote, and I want to get your reaction and perhaps the further explanation on this. And I quote, Ukrainian victory now seems out of reach. Some influential experts go further, insisting that Kyiv will suffer only more death and destruction by persisting and should seek a political settlement with Moscow, even if it requires sacrificing territory. Now, Mr. Menon, help us with better understanding. Why is it a bad deal, or even it's not even a deal for Ukraine at this moment to negotiate with Moscow? And what does that say about the attitude among the international community members? Your thoughts?
There are two answers to that question, Will. One is that if you look at the long sweep of this war, and as you mentioned, we're entering year 3, we should not even be in this place because Russia is a superpower fighting a country that is much weaker. And I don't think Mr. Putin had any idea that he would be bogged down in this war. Ukrainians have actually done better than most people believe. So at the end of 2022, they took back about 54% of the territory they had lost since the invasion of February 2022. Cleared out Russia from the north, from the northeast, and from parts of the south. In the year 2023, it was a little different. The Ukrainian counteroffensive failed. But if you look at the net gain in territory in Russia's favor, about 150 square miles. That's about half the area of metropolitan Kiev. So the real question now is, if you sign an agreement with Putin, will he take what in Russian is called a peredishka, that is a deep breath, and then use that to continue? Or can there be a viable solution? My own belief is Ukraine may not be able to take back all of its territory. The real question is, if Western aid continues, can Ukraine remain in the fight long enough so that Putin concludes that there is no way he can achieve anything that would be a dramatic success? That doesn't mean Russia may not win territory. So the question is not really Ukraine defeating Russia, which is not possible. It's truly giving it the means to stay in the fight. Now, as you alluded to in your introduction, that's all very unclear now because American military aid is in doubt.
Mr. Menon, let's talk about this. Again, we know that the war in Ukraine today, it's actually dividing the international community. Again, some countries still believe that, again, as we mentioned before, from the Western perspective, it is fundamental purpose that for Ukrainians and especially the military continue to fight forth, and so that we are going to protect what we call the sovereignty for Ukraine. But on the other hand, some members are questioning whether the result is going to be pleasing for Ukraine. Now, at this moment, I still want to go back to the article that you said, and I quote, that Ukrainians' leader and citizens, particularly those from younger generations, have decided that their future lies with the West, not Russia. Now, we know that today, when we look at this geopolitical change, every single country, to be fair, is standing at the crossroads. We're looking at this geopolitical change, military change, and also this economic agenda. What do you mean when you say that Ukrainians' leaders or citizens, their future lies with the West, not Russia? And clearly today, if we pay attention to the West, I want to be careful. It's not a unified voice. It's not really a unified country anymore. Don't you think that division within the West could even lead to another disaster or perhaps even much greater risk for Ukraine? What do you think of that?
Well, you're completely correct that the Ukraine war has divided the international community. Broadly speaking, I would say that the global South and China have somewhat greater sympathy for Russia. India is not taking sides, but it has certainly helped Russia by buying a lot of its oil and so on. So there's no question. Part of the reason, I think, for the skepticism in the global South is that the United States often talks about the rules-based international order or universal human rights principles, but often betrays it. So when it invokes it on this occasion, it is completely natural for people to be cynical. So, for example, let us take the war in Gaza, where the latest count is that about 30,000 people have died, mostly women and children. The United States has kind of wagged its finger at Israel and said, oh, you shouldn't do this, you should be more careful. But every day condemns Russia in a very, very different and much more forthright way. And so people are going to ask, well, do you believe these principles apply to everybody or not? So I'm not here to tell you that the U.S. has handled everything perfectly. Now, in the case of Ukraine, first, we have to understand that the Ukrainians are not asking for anyone to fight on their behalf. Macron recently came out and said, well, European troops will fight in Europe. He did that without obviously coordinating with his colleagues, but the Ukrainians have never asked for that. They have no expectation that that will happen. What they want is weaponry, right? And the question is, what are the costs of giving them weapons? Now, I have a friend of mine who is a military officer who served multiple tours of duty, and he said, I hate war. War brings destruction and suffering. It is of no purpose, and we have to end the war. My response to that is, that may well be true, but is it for us to make the decision, or is it for Ukraine to make the decision, given that they're not asking for anything other than military support? And I make this point because I've been to Ukraine now 4 times since the invasion, and I've traveled to all parts of it, including to various parts of the front. And I keep asking people, look, has the suffering and destruction gotten to be so bad that it really is time to seek some kind of settlement with Russia? And I haven't encountered a single person who has said so. Now, in terms of your question about Ukrainians, especially younger ones, deciding that their fate lies with the West, soon after Ukraine became independent, the country was very divided on NATO, and the eastern and southern parts of Ukraine were places where Russia had a great deal of sympathy. The war has changed all that because the eastern and southern parts have been destroyed and suffered much more than have other parts of the country. And so I mentioned in my article that you can find Ukrainian troops whose native language is Russian, but who are fighting against Ukrainians. Every time I go to Ukraine, especially among younger people, when they talk about where they'd like to live, where they'd like to work, what languages they're learning, it's all about the West. And of course, there's a lot of enthusiasm for NATO. Now, I personally think that Ukraine will not necessarily get into NATO, but the shift in terms of wanting to join NATO has changed. So my point is, you could have a very strange situation where Putin achieves some kind of military victory, but in the course of that, Ukraine moves westward. And his invasion was not just to carve out parts of Ukrainian territory, but to keep Ukraine in Russia's orbit. In that sense, I think he will have failed.
Well, Mr. Menon, again, going back to what you just said, it is not a surprise that Putin today is rather playing a dangerous game. I mean, it's not just because of the war in Ukraine, and also despite the friends that he has, and meanwhile, that it's truthful that majority of the international members can't stand about what he's doing. I mean, again, this is just bring trauma and also devastation upon the citizens in both countries or even the whole world. But let's go to another person who is Viktor Orban, the current prime minister of Hungary. And again, this is something you also mentioned, that it seems to be the case that he is one of the few Putin's friends and continue to advocate for Putin's behavior and continue to believe and support that it is important for Russia to contain Ukraine, or even to say get back what the or value the word sovereignty. I mean, again, let's talk about this. What role does Viktor Orban actually play when we look at the war? I mean, again, this is not the first day of the war. This is not the first year, but this is almost the third year, year 3 for the war in Ukraine. But we still continue to see the consistency attitude in Viktor Orban. What does that say about this person? And what does that say about the circle of friends for Vladimir Putin? Your thoughts, sir?
Right. So Viktor Orban, and he's not alone, by the way. There's now Robert Fico, the prime minister of Slovakia. Have a very different view of this war and toward Putin. No question. And they can make a difference because let's take, for example, the question of whether Ukraine gets into NATO. You need unanimity. So if one member state, let's say Hungary or Slovakia, says no, that's the end of NATO membership for Ukraine, at least as far as the eye can see, which is why I've always said, I understand why Ukraine wants to join NATO, but I think it may have to think about alternative ways of arranging its security arrangements, and we can talk about that. So there's no question. But Orban is not alone. In the Trump wing of the Republican Party in the United States, there's a remarkably similar attitude toward the war than in the rest of the Republican Party and certainly the Democratic Party. And in other parts of the world, you have people who are like that. In Brazil, you have Lula now, but his predecessor was very much like that, right? China, I think, is in a different category. I think that it benefits from having the West wholly preoccupied in this war and having Russia more and more dependent on China. China comes out of this actually in a fairly strong position. So yes, the world is not of a uniform mind when it comes to the Ukraine war. There are divisions in the West. So let's take another example. When Macron said, well, we might have to think about sending European troops to fight in Ukraine. Immediately, 2 major countries in European NATO, Poland and Germany, said, no, we're not doing this. So no question, there are divisions. In the case of EU assistance, Orban may have tried to get the EU to drag its feet, but overall the EU plan to assist Ukraine is going forward. The problem is that Europe for so long has kind of neglected its defense that as of now, the United States has provided in dollar terms more military aid than all of its allies put together. So let's assume that Trump is elected or this bill for Ukraine military aid never gets voted on in our House of Representatives. Europe is not in a position to fill the gap that will be left by the United States, even if Orban were to say, well, let's go ahead and fill it. Right? So Ukraine is in a vulnerable position now. There's no question about it.
Mr. Menon, let's bring another country into our conversation. For example, the nation of Moldova. I mean, recently, the president of the Republic of Moldova wrote an interesting article on Wall Street Journal. Again, this is something rather alarming. The title of the article is called "My Country Moldova is Russia's Next Target." Now, I want to read something to you, and again, you're the expert on this, so help us with better understanding, and I quote, "For Vladimir Putin's regime, freedom is something to be denied. It's why Russia is waging 3 wars simultaneously: a ruthless military, a hybrid war of interference and disinformation, and last but not least, a war of repression at home." Now, for the country such as Moldova, why is it so concerning that, again, going back to the point, continuation of support for the nation of Ukraine, and also for other countries such as Moldova, how fearful and how concerning it is at this moment when we look at the progress on the ground? Your thoughts, sir?
So let's take the most general view to start with. And this is not excusing Putin's behavior, but simply sharing with you my thoughts about how big powers, China, Russia, the United States, tend to behave. They like to be the dominant power in their immediate neighborhood. The United States has wanted that since pretty much the start of the Republic. The Monroe Doctrine, for example, is one example. The Roosevelt Corollary, which added to the Monroe Doctrine, is another example. So we have used various forms of intervention to make sure that we are dominant. I'll give you one example. Recently, Equatorial Guinea, this tiny little country, was negotiating an agreement with the Chinese Navy for just 4 calls in the harbor of Equatorial Guinea. The United States sent a high-level delegation to Equatorial Guinea and said, you can't do this because this is an area where we have major interests, right? So what Putin's doing historically is not that different. Now, you asked about Transnistria. This actually precedes Putin. In the early 1990s, when Boris Yeltsin was, and this goes back to my point about how great powers behave, when Boris Yeltsin was the president, he helped foment separatist movements in Georgia to break away parts of Georgia, South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Same thing in Transnistria. Now, what does Transnistria mean? It means the other side of the Dniester River, which has a Russian majority. So there has been in Transnistria a kind of a breakaway republic that says we're not part of Moldova. And it is leaning toward Russia. So when the Moldovan prime minister says we are in a vulnerable position, he's asking the question, is Putin's next move going to be in Transnistria? Because when he's fighting a war with Ukraine, if you look at the map, you have Ukraine here, Moldova here, and Transnistria in the beginning, in the middle. So he'd have a kind of position on the western flank of Ukraine. Now, I can't tell you I know what's going to happen in Transnistria, but it's certainly worth watching to see what happens. It will be very interesting to see. And I understand the Moldovan concern. Now, will Putin, in the middle of a war in Ukraine, also decide to achieve a strategic emplacement in Transnistria? And how much would that help him? How would he sustain troops there? Because of the geographical distance, that's all to be thought about very carefully. But there's no question that something is going on, and we ought to keep an eye on what happens in Transnistria, no doubt.
Mr. Menon, 2 more questions before letting you go. Now, let's talk about your book. Again, this is an amazing book called Conflict in Ukraine, The Unwinding of the Post-Cold War Order. Now, again, when we study history, we shouldn't be surprised about any details regarding Cold War. Now, when we look at the complexity of the geopolitical change, the political agenda of China, again, the war in Ukraine, and of course, this, what we call the ambition, as you mentioned before, for the current president of Brazil, Lula. Now, putting everything together, what does that mean when we look at the post-Cold War order? So are we saying, or are you saying that those countries today are actually reshaping the international order, or reshaping this traditional or this conventional mindset regarding Cold War comprehension? So what are your thoughts and purposes for that?
Yeah, that's a good and complicated question. I'll try to answer it as briefly as possible so I don't test the patience of your audience. Let's start with 1989. All of a sudden, communist, Soviet-dominated Eastern Europe, the communist regimes fell one by one. And unlike what the Soviets did in Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968, lo and behold, Gorbachev did not send troops to suppress the revolts. He said to the European communist governments, you have to reform and you have to achieve autonomy. So very quickly, that part of the Soviet bloc, if you will, kind of disintegrated, and you had post-communist governments. And then, surprisingly, Gorbachev's reforms triggered a process which led to the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it happened fairly peacefully. So in the United States then, there was great euphoria. Thomas Friedman wrote a book saying that globalization is the wave of the future, that trade and investment ties would knit Russia and Eastern Europe together with the United States. Francis Fukuyama said it's the end of history in the sense that there was no alternative anymore intellectually to liberal democracy. And the belief was that there could be an end of conflict and a coming together of Russia, where Russia, with Western help, democratized, became a market economy, and so on. By the end of the 90s, that experiment was already in doubt because the reforms in Russia led to inequality, a great deal of poverty. NATO expansion began and boosted the power in Russia of people who were nationalists and saw that as a hostile act. The 2014-15 crisis in Ukraine, where Russia responded to the Maidan movement, a kind of grassroots movement, which was in favor of integrating with the European Union by seizing Crimea and helping breakaway republics in eastern Ukraine. That led to the end, I think, of the belief that somehow we had reached this world of milk and honey, where liberalism and economic ties would triumph over great power rivalry and nationalism. So when I talk about in my book, the subtitle, The End of the Post-Cold War Order, I don't mean that there was a kind of concrete order with institutions and so on. I mean that there was a kind of expectation about where history was going. And I think 2014-15 was the definitive rupture. But even before that, trouble had happened between Russia and the United States. I'll just give you one example. In 2008, George W. Bush pressured his NATO allies at the Bucharest summit of NATO to open the door to Ukraine. Just in principle, they didn't want to do it. There was no consensus. But the United States is a very powerful country in NATO. And so they came out with a statement saying, one day we look forward to welcoming Ukraine and Georgia. Now, Putin did not take very kindly to that. And what did he do? He launched an invasion against Georgia to support its breakaway republics, which the current government then was trying to take back, at least one of them. So we've had since 2007, 2008 already a move of estrangement between Russia and Ukraine. Now, did I think that it would culminate in what happened in 2014, 15, let alone what happened in February 22 of 2022, 24, February 24 of 2022? Absolutely not. I was caught by, I never expected Putin to launch a full-on invasion of Ukraine, which in land area is the largest country in Europe if you set Western Russia apart. But here we are. I think it's very clear that all of those illusions and ideas and optimism about what would happen in the wake of the end of the Cold War have been put to rest. And Orban, whom you mentioned, is a classic example. He's a member of NATO, but he's certainly not liberal and has a complicated relationship, shall we say, with democracy and a very good relationship with Mr. Putin.
Mr. Menon, I want to wrap up our conversation. Again, I'm very glad that you end the last note on the word democracy. Again, going back to the article, it is crucial, and of course, it is indispensable for us to continue to understand that the message, excuse me, to unify the international community regarding supporting Ukraine is the message that fight for freedom, justice, and democracy. Now, the last question I want to ask you, look ahead as we continue to see the behavior of Vladimir Putin and also continue to see this division among the international community. Is it still possible for us to continue to champion the message of democracy, not just for the citizen of Ukraine, not just for the citizen of Russia, but think about this from this global perspective, how essential and important it is today in the midst of the international chaos, in the midst of the international uncertainty, that we still need to continue to value and protect the word and also the concept of democracy with tangible actions. Your final thoughts.
Right. Because you and I live in democratic countries, I think we would readily agree that democracy may not be perfect, but it is better than the alternative.
Yes.
But the world is a complicated place. Rich and poor countries, small and large countries, democratic countries versus non-democratic countries, dictatorships versus democracy. So I think it's too complicated a machinery with so many moving parts. We're going to unite all of the world behind a set of ideas. And your reference to the divisions in the world about the Ukraine war show that to be the case. But if you want to have any decent chance of getting as many countries behind the idea of liberal democracy and human rights, you have to practice as consistently as possible what you preach. If certain countries are allowed to get away with certain behavior that you say that you don't support, but then you don't condemn them, and other countries are condemned for violating those things, many countries in the world will say, well, when the Americans talk about human rights and democracy and liberalism, it's all talk. They're weaponizing these concepts. Now, I'm not saying that's true or not. It doesn't really matter what I think. It creates a great deal of cynicism. So when let's take, for example, the International Court of Justice taking Israel, the South Africans taking Israel to the International Court of Justice. Great deal of support in the global South for this, right? Part of it was, I think, a frustration over the United States doing absolutely nothing to restrain the Israelis. So it's going to be very, very difficult. But a minimum condition is that you have to practice what you preach. Now, in Iraq, for example, the United States practiced certain policies that are very hard to reconcile with the principles of liberalism and human rights, torture, extraordinary rendition, and so on and so forth. So the minimum condition is one has, as best as possible in a difficult world, to be true to one's principles. Even then, for reasons that I pointed out with the complexity of the world, you're not going to unite the world behind the ideas of liberalism and democracy. For Putin and for the Chinese government, for example, liberalism and democracy is a subversive idea. And their belief is that in these ideas, what the United States is trying to do is to undermine their state and their government. So not everybody welcomes democracy.